Welcome everyone to this MP Watch webinar on really quite a historic day. I don't know about you, but I've been completely thrown by the election announcement. And we as a campaign have loads to do. I'm sure you'll all agree. But this webinar was by request from some of the people here. We realized that we have so the campaign is to hold MPs accountable and to enable constituents to hold their MPs accountable. And we realized that we just do not know enough about food, which is important as we look at the polycrises, but also where farming is. We see Liz's protests in Parliament, her very flamboyant protests, but a lot of us don't feel that we really know what's going on. So we thought it would be a great idea to have to ask some key people from that industry to help inform us. So our aim is not necessary. I don't think that some people on this call are very keen environmentalists and will have very strong ideas about what's wrong with farming. But our challenge today is really to think about things in terms of farmers and how we as local groups can communicate and build relationships with people, even across difference where there are, and try to improve things both for the countryside and for our food resilience. I'm sure many here are worried about what we face going forward. So first of all, I'm going to invite Liz Webster, who's from Save British Farming. She was in the past, I believe, involved with the Liberal Democrats, so she's quite politically savvy. And would you mind, Liz, giving us a bit of a context of a kind of brief history of farming and how we came to the present day, and then what is happening, what the main issues are that are bringing farmers out. So because we tend to think of the French and our European cousins as the people who protest in their capital cities. So what's happening in British farming that is leading us to these straits?
Hi, well, thanks very much for asking me on, and it's a pleasure to be here and talk about British farming. Essentially, very quick history recap of farming is that Britain, unlike France, we didn't have a revolution, and we had an empire that fed us. And after the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 and the Industrial Revolution, it really changed the whole dynamics of the setup of the country. And a lot of people moved from working on estates to going into cities and finding an alternative way of earning money. And then we went through quite a prolonged agricultural depression at that point, because they repealed the Corn Laws and imports came in, and agriculture went through quite a tough time. Then we had 2 world wars and we were short of food. And food was weaponized as the U-boats were sinking the food coming over. And at that point, after the Second World War, in between the 2 wars, there was a decision to protect food security and increase self-sufficiency. At the same time, after the Second World War, we had the Green Revolution, which was where agriculture went through massive improvements with chemical fertilizers, where we could double the yields, and different varieties of wheat and so forth that were more disease resistant, which meant that more food could be produced, more people could be fed. Because really, over the 2 world wars, there was always this the Malthusian panic of running out of available land to be able to feed the number of people, which drove the wars largely and the case for needing an empire. So after the Second World War and the formation of Europe, as we all know, with various events, the empire peeled away, and largely self-sufficiency here picked up to about 80%. We got up to, and we did then join the European Union along those same lines, and food began to get much more varied as more European food came over here. Up until then, I'm sure some of you are as old as me remember the 70s, and mash gets smash, and bird's trifle and tinned ham and spam. And then, in the last 40 odd years, especially since the beginning of the single market, food has become very abundant and the choice has been enormous, and the supermarket shelves have been flowing, and up until Brexit. And really, and I've always said that Brexit is almost like the repeal of the Corn Laws again, but in reverse. The repeal of the Corn Laws freed us from feudalism, and as far as I'm concerned, Brexit is taking us back into a form of feudalism, Brexit and other world events. So the difference between British farmers and the farmers on the continent is that the actual communities, particularly in France, but to a large extent Germany and other countries, they are built on farming, and they understand the connection, probably they understand the connection to where their food comes from, whereas that has been lost largely in Britain. I grew up in South Wales, and we were heavily bombed during the war. My grandfather was a cook in the RAF, and he came back and bought a farm in Cardiff. So for me, I've always been aware of food shortages. I was brought up with being concerned about my grandfather. I've still got his cookery book here from when he was in the RAF, how to feed 100 men on lard, pretty much, and tinned peas. So I've always been aware of that. And I think from the moment I heard of a Brexit vote, the first thing I thought of was food. This is going to be a problem for food. And I was right. So the reason we started campaigning was Farmers for a People's Vote with Sean Rickard, who used to be the chief economist of the NFU. We got together and he wrote a report about what Brexit, particularly a no-deal Brexit, meant for farming. And we launched that before the 2019 election. We took we hired some stunt sheep and did that in Whitehall and got lots of publicity. And then, of course, we did the Remain field here led by donkeys. And then, unfortunately, Joe Swinson and Corbyn let Boris have the election, and we all know the recent history. So in 2020, we formed again to try and resist the agriculture bill as it was going through, because we knew what was coming. We knew they were going to largely make environmental incentives. So we were trying to stop an American trade deal, which is cataclysmic for British farming and public health, but also to try and keep control of our standards, our food standards, to stop them bringing in lower standard produce. And sadly, whilst we all got marched up the hill with the NFU and Minette Batters, that we failed to do that because she capitulated and allowed them to go ahead with the Trade and Agriculture Commission. I don't know if you remember that meeting of Minette Batters around the table where she sent the letter to Boris and he said he would die before he hurt farming. And so, here we are, a few awful trade deals later. Everything that we thought would happen has happened, and a lot worse, because we have been impacted by various other shocks, the Ukraine war for one, COVID another. And so I think farmers really have, before Brexit happened, the problem we've always had, or since the 60s, it began in 1964 when the Tories repealed the Resale Price Maintenance Act. And that happened at more or less the same time that Tesco's was born. And what that piece of legislation used to mean was that middlemen and supermarkets couldn't pay beneath the cost of production. And that was the beginning of the sort of erosion of control that farmers had over their market, or one of the beginnings of that. And it's just got worse. It got worse under Thatcher as she disbanded the Milk Marketing Board. And I think that's why some farmers thought Brexit was an answer, I think just through sheer exasperation, because I think thought, well, we just need a big shake-up. And they also blamed the European Union for much of what our own domestic governments have done. But now we are in a position where I think most people agree Brexit has failed to deliver on its promises. And a lot of farming food businesses are giving up, whether they're voluntarily going into an environmental scheme, or whether they've shut up shop and given up altogether. Because if you don't have that much land, then it's going to be difficult to go into an environmental scheme. So it actually, the whole way it works with the SFI, really, it works better. The bigger your farm, the better it is for you, which is,
I'm
again,
so sorry. What's the SFI?
Oh, sorry, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is part of the ELMS project.
Okay. Okay.
So,
So, would you mind just going through exactly now what you think is the worst, kind of most gnarly Brexit legacy that you would like maybe Labour to get to grips with if they come into power?
yeah, I mean, we're calling for a return of some sort of resale price maintenance act. We want something. We want some legislative power to stop the supermarkets feasting on us. And the French have got something similar to this. So I think that's an absolute prerequisite. We need something like that. We
And
need them
forgive
to.
me, Liz, I'm probably being a bit stupid, but I don't completely understand how that worked in the past. So is it really complicated, or is there a kind of
It just means that they cannot, once the supermarkets will not be able to pay beneath the price of production. So what they've been doing, especially since Brexit, is because they opened the floodgates to imports for 3.5 years from Europe with no reciprocal checks. So we had checks on our exports, nothing coming in the other way. And so it started by, I don't know if you remember the pig crisis in the early days, a lot of the European pigs were coming in, pig meat, and then they were cheaper. A, they're subsidized, B, they didn't, all of these things.
So I think what's happening then is imports are cheaper, and so the supermarkets only want to pay the farmers here the same price as the imports. Is
The
that right?
supermarkets or the processors, the middlemen,
Yes.
will set the benchmark of what they're going to pay on what the market has got. I mean, this is how capitalism works. So they will say, we're paying, we're paying you. I mean, that's why all the apples have been grubbed over in Kent, a large number of them. There's not many apple growers left now because all of the apples were coming in at a cheaper rate. And the supermarkets were saying, well, if you want, we're going to ditch the contract we had with you and we're going to pay you what we were paying back in 2018. And a lot of farmers said no.
Sure. So you want a new deal for with a legal framework for British farmers. I think and what do you want from goods coming in? I do believe that one thing which seems a great anomaly is that some foreign produce, if it is packaged here, sometimes gets labelled as British. Is that right, or have I misunderstood that?
Yes, that is happening. And the issue is that because we're on WTO now and we're no longer within the single market, that it's just it's a free for all. It's the Wild West now in terms of, because we're on WTO rules, and they can say, well, you can't have any advantage of over as being the domestic market. So these are the things that we have problems with being such a small country on world markets. So what we want is to get rid of the trade barriers, align with EU regulations, and work to get back in the single market and the customs union. that is absolutely the best way forward for British farming. And we want to ditch these bad trade deals, which the Australia deal in particular is very threatening to us, particularly for beef, because every year over a 15-year period, the quotas go up and up and up, and then it's an infinite amount. And we just won't survive that. Plus, there's other meat coming in from Brazil and South America. It's a huge threat to us.
No, yes, I've been reading about that. In fact, I read that when the New Zealand, not the Australian, I think, deal was done, that the people in New Zealand couldn't quite believe that we just didn't negotiate for anything. We just sort of, it seemed like the PR stunt of having any kind of deal was more important than actually what the conditions were. And that British farmers were just sort of sold down the river. And I mean, it always seemed a bit mad, didn't it? Striking a deal with countries the opposite side of the globe, when we are just kind of severed with a close.
Well, the other thing they did in 2020 was they removed food as a public good, and that really set alarm bells ringing for me and switched that to the environment. And the whole point is that farmers can produce food and look after the environment. It's not one or the other. But the other thing that people may not be aware of, that there has been some press coverage as we talk about the Wye Valley problems with, factory farming, is that since 2016, since the Brexit vote, there's been over 200 of these mega farms opened up in Britain. And they've really spiraled out, a lot.
2016, really?
Yes.
Okay.
So this is the problem with the greenwashing. And it was always something that I said, was that British farming is still, and in fact, Boris Johnson said it himself in the pig crisis, he said that farming had been holding us back. British farming is much better than other countries. We farm much more sustainably, and the greenhouse gas input is meant to be 10%, whereas the world figure is 30%. So if we really wanted to do something about climate change with food production, we should have been actually exporting our sustainable farming methods, not standing it down to do park keeping, to then open up factories here to damage the environment and poison the public. I
think we'll move on to Guy in a moment, but who's behind the mega farms?
Avara, so it's Cargill.
Okay, so and where are they based? Avara.
Yeah, I don't know that I can give you there's a good article in the Times, but if you Google, there's I think the Independent have run it and other publications over the last few months. But there's a big pig unit in Suffolk. They're trying to get through planning at the moment.
Right. Okay. It's in Suffolk.
Yes.
Okay. That's interesting.
So in Therese Coffey's constituency. So it's actually really what's the word? It's really irritating that farmers are get a lot of criticism for lots of different things. And we're told that for ages, it's because our cows are farting and all of these things that's going on. And suddenly it feels like we're being stood down, retired, to then be replaced by imports and factories. And I don't believe that's what British people want. And it is the most deceitful thing that's been delivered. So we are working with the Labour Party. In fact, I'm giving some evidence to the Scottish Parliament tomorrow. I'm working with a Labour think tank, and we will be working hard to try and make sure that we get some good changes through. So there's,
who are you working with in the Labour team?
So Daniel Zeitner's done a fair bit of work with us over the 4-5 years we've been going, and then I work with someone called Mike Buckley.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. Appreciate that. So, Guy, would you like to? I know you've got some slides. Why don't you do a little introduction to Riverford and your work, and then I can take it from there and ask you some questions if you prefer.
Okay.
And then we'll go to questions from the other people on the webinar.
Yeah. The slides give a bit of an introduction and maybe address some of the things we should be talking about, and I'll try and scoot over the stuff that yeah, there we go. So I started growing vegetables in 1987 at Riverford in the Dart Valley in South Devon. And I did initially, it was really just a wheelbarrow and delivering to local shops in the back of my car. The business grew very quickly. I had the support of a family that were tenant farmers. And I supplied to wholesalers in London, and then inevitably we ended up starting supplying supermarkets. We were quite early on the organic thing, and they wanted to buy it, so that was good for a bit. Though I never enjoyed it very much. In fact, I hated it. I could go on for a long time about the behaviour of supermarket buyers, but it's perhaps not relevant. And that led to us starting to sell direct to consumer with I think the third veg box scheme in the country started in 1993. That is a shot of our farm. We're typically pretty undulating. That's a south-facing slope, about 25% slope. And that's typically how we harvest. It's very manual. We rely on well-motivated staff working in typically groups of 8 or so. It's very, very different to the way most vegetables are produced. And I was actually on Farming Today this morning commenting on Rishi Sunak's suggestion that we should get the work shy onto farms. I'm not sure that we want the work shy on farms. And his second thing seemed to be that this was a way that we would address a mental health crisis, that we would probably soothe them on our farms and so on, which is equally ridiculous because that is the reality of how most vegetables are grown. That's a celery harvesting rig pushing its way across the fens with maybe 20 people standing out the front of it. And if you don't move fast enough, it'll just run you over. There won't be a word of English spoken in the field. Hardly a place to address someone's mental health issues, I wouldn't have said. It just shows how woefully out of touch he is. Again, I feel we're growing on a reasonable scale. I mean, that's a 10-acre field of lettuces. We plant exactly what we think we'll be selling that week. That's looking up to Dartmoor in the future. We started a cooperative of farmers to supply us. I'm not an advocate of large-scale farming, and I'd much rather work with other largely sort of family-based farms. I also farm in France. That's in Western France, in the Vendée, where we grow all sorts of vegetables, including chilies. And we buy quite extensively from growers in Southern Europe. This is Pepe, who grows spinach and asparagus for us just south of Granada. We pretty much buy everything that he sells. He's a third generation farmer. He was actually here last weekend, along with a lot of our other suppliers, for a conference. I count him as a personal friend, actually, as I do many of the people who supply us. I don't think many people would say that of a supermarket buyer. Our last supermarket supply was, I think, 2001, which made me very happy. We have a restaurant on the farm, so we're building connections with the farm and telling the story about how the food is produced. And I do feel that supermarkets are a major obstacle to improving farm practice because they just purely and simply buy on price. And if you're doing it a better job from an environmental or a social point of view than others, you have no way of differentiating yourself. I mean, there is virtually no branded produce, farm branded produce on the supermarket shelves. I'm happy to talk about that. I'm going to skip over this bit because I don't think it's relevant. I also work with farmers in East Africa. One of the issues, I've got 4 key issues, which I hope we'll talk about. I mean, actually, one was labour, and we'll probably come back to that. And it's probably particularly an issue for my sector, the horticultural sector. The other one is climate change, which is happening much faster and having much bigger impacts sooner than I think anyone, including me, envisaged. This is a slide of a pretty catastrophic soil loss event we had on the farm, which did reduce me to tears. So this was 3 years ago. This field has been planted. It's the same field that I showed that first photograph of, actually, almost from the same place. This will never be ploughed again. It's gone into a silver pasture stream. We're growing hazelnuts with grass in between. It's just too high risk,
given the changing. And I think last winter, you know, which has been a catastrophe for a lot of farmers, was another example of the impact of climate change, rapidly changing weather patterns. You know, scientists and sometimes politicians, you know, quote averages and that they're not changing that quickly. And indeed, some people are even irritating enough to suggest that higher CO2 levels and warmer temperatures might increase yields. It's not the averages that affect farmers, it's the extremes. And this is what we're seeing as an extreme, and last winter was an extreme. I think I might fly over this. So I've gone into a much more agroecological way of farming, trying to you know, bring more trees back into the landscape. This is a walnut tree I planted 30 years ago. We're intercropping vegetables with apples, artichokes with apples in this case, and here planting the first large-scale agroforestry, which was walnuts with cattle grazing in between. And there it is 2 years later on the farm. I have a bit of obsession with growing perennial crops and even wild harvesting, wild garlic out in the woods on the left there, quite contentious. And this is a perennial kale, which we're trying to commercialize with some difficulty. All these things are really difficult to do. They're expensive research projects, which there's no money, you know, left over in a supply contract to pay for any sort of transition towards a greener form of farming. That's about the only words I ever show. We have a suppliers charter, which you can see on the Riverford website if you or Google it, which is, I think, an exemplar of how the relationship should be between farmers and retailers, and seeking long-term mutually beneficial relationships, building trust, and supporting a more sustainable form of farming. And as part of that, I did get really quite incensed by this last year, and we did put quite a lot of time and effort into a campaign called Get Fair About Farming, when we did a survey and found that half of fruit and vegetable growers think they will be out of business next year. And the reasons they cite are the turmoil of Brexit and the transition to ELMS, which Liz referred to, labour shortages and climate change. And so I think those are the three critical things that we should be asking our MPs about, along with food security, as Liz raised. Anyway, we got 100,000 signatures. It was debated in Westminster. About 20 MPs got up and, you know, said fine words of support. And then the agriculture minister got up and said, nah, I don't think I'll do anything about that. And it all felt like a bit of a waste of time. Riverford is employee owned. I'm not going to go into that. I don't think that's the day we became employee owned. We're also a B Corp, you know, trying to differentiate ourselves. I'm happy, you know, anyway, the idea that we measure the impact that we have on the environment, on society, on our customers. Happy to talk about that if anyone wants. Carbon labelling, we put a lot of effort into. I'm deeply skeptical about it. We do a report every year. I think we are an exemplar of what should be done. It's really a guide for us on how we can improve, as opposed to really telling other people how wonderful we are. And we did actually carbon label our boxes for a while, and I hope that this might differentiate ourselves. And I'll come back to this, and we all think much less than we think, which is perhaps a complex way, I think, of saying that any idea that a rational consumer is going to drive improvements in agriculture and transition us to a greener way of farming is just patently ridiculous. We carbon labeled our boxes for 2 years, took a huge amount of resource. I never met a single person whose purchasing decision was influenced by that. Yet that is the main mantra of the government that we've had for the last 14 years. We don't need to worry about this because, you know, an informed consumer will drive better farming practices. That is the line that our local MP, Anthony Magnell, spouts. And whenever I hear him say it, I want to tear his head off, actually. I mean, I just can't believe it's such ridiculous ideological dogma. You know, we need the government to act, to regulate, to have a green form of agriculture. I think there's a tremendous problem with agriculture that it's kind of undervalued, unseen, and largely sort of romanticized. And again, I think Rishi Sunak's comments that we're going to deal with an epidemic of poor mental health by getting people out on farms is just so absurdly romantic, and sort of shows a woeful disconnect between the reality of what goes on in the countryside. So that's more about that. It's bloody difficult to make money out of it. If we want to have greener agriculture, we should tax fossil fuels, which I'm guessing from what Liz said she would agree with. It's the cause of 89% of climate change. It's not enteric emissions from dairy cows or beef or cattle. It's burning fossil fuels. 89% of climate change over the last 10 years. If we want to solve the problem, and if we are neoliberal free marketeers, well, tax the thing that is the problem, and it would solve it very, very quickly. Don't look to farmers to make up for the pollution caused by the fossil fuel industry. And that's my bit done.
Thank you, Guy. You said that climate change was one of, I can't remember whether it was 3 or 4 challenges. I think you maybe said 3 at one point and 4 at another. But can you give us some examples? I mean, obviously there was the flooding this over last winter and spring. But are there any other things that you've noticed as a farmer in touch with seeing the land and, 1 year after the other? Anything else?
Well, and we have had presentations from the Met Office and Exeter University on this, and it's as I said, I think the extremes and the unpredictability. Farming practices has evolved over decades based on the assumption that if you sow on that date, you'll harvest on that date, and you can expect roughly this weather conditions in between. I mean, no one can make those assumptions anymore. So a lot of arable farmers didn't manage to sow a crop last autumn because it was too wet. If they did, a lot of it died in the seedbed, and taking the train up to London, I see evidence of that all the time. And then in the spring, it was too wet to sow then. So they might have sown a spring wheat or barley, but it was really too wet for most people until mid-April, and that's just too late. So that it's been pretty catastrophic. Less damaging, but equally problematic for dairy farmers and livestock farmers not be able to turn their stock out because the ground's just too wet, and it goes on. We had a frost on the 23rd of May last year, which killed a lot of our crops, which, that's unheard of to have a frost later. So it's not getting colder. It's not necessarily or warmer or wetter or drier.
More
it's just
erratic, but more erratic.
Yeah, more erratic and longer periods of extreme weather. Yeah.
Really interesting. And what about, yes, for your particular approach, then it looks like labour is key. Obviously, that would have been affected by Brexit. Is that, besides sort of letting more people into the country who would do that, do you have any other ideas for that?
Well, I'm a bit of a I make myself unpopular with other horticulturalists because I actually don't like the idea that our horticultural industry is solely dependent on a sort of underclass of people, because British people don't want to work. I'd love to live in a world where, British people wanted to work on British farms. And sorry, are you still there? Something's changed on my screen.
We're all still here. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, but that's going to be very, very hard. The stark reality is that most British people, it's very, very physically arduous, and most people just don't want to do that sort of work. There are, however, a lot of people who do want to enter new entrants, and on a much smaller scale, and they want to be running their own business and being autonomous and having, agency over their lives and learning how to become great growers and so on. And I'd love to encourage them. I have deep reservations about the economic viability of even medium scale production. I mean, at anything like the prices that farmers are having to be prepared to produce that. So I don't really have any easy answers to that question, short of a massive restructuring of our whole industry. And, I think I would love to see, I mean, the major vegetable producers, there are only about half a dozen of them now. And it's important to realize when you talk about supermarkets and how they buy, supermarkets almost never buy directly from farmers. There's almost always a middle person. And that person may, in the case of horticulture, be growing. There's Produce World, there's G's, I can't forget, there are a few very large companies that supply most of the supermarkets. They'll grow a few vegetables themselves, and then outsource most of it. So, and they are the agents that are screwing the farmers. They're doing the supermarkets dirty.
Okay, so the supermarkets don't have to do it anymore. Somebody
No, they
does
don't have to. And
for
there
them.
is some regulation about supermarket behavior, but absolutely no regulation about how those packers treat their suppliers.
Okay, so in a moment, I think we'll go over to questions. Um, I'm not sure what time we put on the flyer, but I'm kind of hoping you might be okay to stay till 8:15. But if you're
Yeah, no,
expecting,
that's what we had. Yeah,
okay,
if I
brilliant.
could a little bit on the transition and Brexit and so on. I'm
Sure.
not as critical as most farmers are, and that I do believe the mantra that came up by Michael Gove, public money for public goods, is a good one. I don't see why taxpayers should subsidize farmers, some of whom have behaved pretty badly over the years in terms of denying public access and sometimes have a poor environmental record. But, I do think they should be rewarded for providing environmental services or public access. And that seems to be the fundament of ELMS. Well, the problem with it is that requires you quantifying what those public services are. And there lies the problem. And I think it was supremely arrogant to think that this was going to be simple or quick, because quantifying the value of an earthworm or a buzzard or a old oak tree or whatever, is really the realms of God, I would say. I mean, it's going to be very, very difficult to do. And I think there lie a lot of the problems that have emerged over the last 6 years or so.
And it sounds like Liz has an idea with the resale price maintenance. Do you have
Yeah, I was listening to you there, Liz, and the idea that you can't sell or buy anything, offer a price for anything less than the cost of production does rather assume that there is a sort of standard cost of production. Of course, many farms will have different cost of production, and if your cost of production, I mean, and a lot of the actual costs that we incur are externalized. So all around us, the South Devon is turning silver as farms grow maize under a form of plastic which will break down into microplastics. It's not compostable. And it's so that may make their milk very marginally cheaper, but everyone else is bearing the cost of the pollution that comes around as a result of that. And I think so many of the costs of farming are externalized. I mean, unless you could internalize all of those and internalize the benefits if you're sequestering carbon, I think that sort of monetary approach, though I would love to see it, I mean, clearly, I don't think anyone should be obliged to sell.
Do you have an idea though? Because it sounds like the supermarkets are oppressive, and I think even those who don't know anything about farming, kind of we know that.
Okay.
What
I don't have any silver bullets. I don't think there, but I think we should be looking for a lot of small incremental improvements. And the most important one, which will cross many areas, is just honesty. I would love it to be illegal to deceive the public, and the supermarkets are just deceiving us. Why is Tesco's telling us that their chickens come from Willow Farm with a picture of a free-range chicken when they come from an intensive broiler house in the on a farm that isn't anything, that isn't Willow Farm? It's just so patently deceit, and sometimes it's not even produced in this country. I mean, surely that should be illegal.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, we want to hold MPs up to account and make them lose their jobs if they're found to be lying, either about climate or about anything. And yes, our public life, we need to have those standards against.
Well, I am essentially a reluctant capitalist, and I do, it's pretty much the only game in town. But for capitalism to work for us all, it has to be regulated, and we have to have some absolute fundamentals of sort of honesty, which are lacking. And it's market failure. The British public actually want to buy from. They want to support family farms. They want to buy from identified, and they are denied that opportunity by the mendacious, behavior of our supermarkets.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, great. So Marine, I think Marine is going to check the chat for questions and invite people to address their questions either to both Guy and Liz, or to whichever one is most pertinent?
Yeah.
I'd like you to ask your own questions, but Marijn will invite you.
Yeah, there's lots of chat going on. People are really engaged with this. So thank you so much, Liz and Guy, for your really interesting talks. We've got lots of questions for you. Janice, would you direct messaged me your question. Would you like to ask your question to Liz and Guy? Janice Single. Or I'm happy to ask it for you. So Janice has asked, how will the government persuade more arable farmers to farm sustainably? Is a question for you.
I think, you know, you have to define sustainable, because the answers aren't clear. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to the argument whether you're in favor of land sparing or land sharing. Many people would say an arable farm would be more sustainable if you had livestock on it and had a proper rotation, including grass, clover, lays for a few years to build fertility, and you'd get less soil-borne disease and you'd need less nitrogen fertilizer and so on. However, I think we do need to be on, and that's how I would like to farm. But I think we do need to be honest that there is a problem with that in a country which is roughly, I don't know, 50 or 60% self-sufficient in its food. That if you take land out of arable production and graze animals on it, which is, I don't know whether Liz and I are going to disagree on this, but it is a fundamentally inefficient way of producing food compared to actually eating the grain or the pulses ourselves. If you do that, and as a result we produce less, we're going to import more, and possibly from less regulated economies, and probably contribute, certainly in the case of imported soya and grain generally, you know, we're going to contribute to the deforestations of regions like the Amazon. So it's far from clear, you know, what sustainable farming is actually. We often talk as if we know that regenerative farming is sustainable, and it can be. The name sounds good, but I think there's so many different arguments about this, from, you know, some people, George Monbiot, arguing that we should be producing all our protein in a lab, and I can see some rational arguments for that. I don't fancy it much myself, but, you know, to regenerative agriculture, whatever that means, to me growing nuts in a field with animals growing in between. I mean, there isn't clarity or agreement, I would say, on what sustainable is. I don't know, Liz, would you disagree?
Yeah, Liz, what would you say?
I think once you get into the weeds of lots of different farms, and where every farm is unique. I mean, this is what gets you, and people turn around and say, you farmers, you all vote Brexit and you all vote Tory. Every farm is unique. And you have to be led by, I mean, here, you know, we're very low lying, so we are a mixed farm. You know, we can grow grass incredibly well here, which means that it's always had livestock on this farm. We don't have a problem with soil erosion because of, you know, thousands of years of being on the Thames and having lots of clay. So every farm has a different problem. And some farms, so we've got friends who are up on the chalk, who are actually doing better with the climate change, because the chalk it deals with the runoff of the rain as a sponge, and then also it holds the moisture so they can deal with the drought a lot more. So I think we just have to keep doing the best that we can do. I think it's quite difficult when you as a farmer, you feel constantly under attack, that you've got people watching you and not really appreciating everything that you're trying to do, which is to produce food and look after the land. I don't know any farmer who doesn't care about the farm that they're farming. Even if they're tenant farmers, I think they want to get the best out of it. Apart from farmers that are putting factory farms in, those are being, you know, they're a different way of farming altogether. And I think it's enormously sad if we do lose all of our farming traditions and we become more Americanized. So I think we should be I think we should celebrate the way we have farmed and the way we still do at the moment, and try and hold on to what we've got, rather than trying to be too anally controlling of everything, and making sure that everybody produces food to a higher standard and looks after the land to a higher standard. As I said, it's not one or the other. You don't have to sort of say, I'm only going to be doing park keeping, environmental work, and then not producing food. But at the moment, you know, some of the environmental schemes, and I know some big farms who've put nearly all of their farm into these environmental schemes, and that is really scary for our food security, and what comes after that.
Thank you so much for that, Liz. And actually, okay, over to Guy, and then I'm going to get mine to ask her question, because it follows yours very nicely. Over to you, Guy.
I just wanted to support what Liz said about every farm being unique. I mean, that is so true. I mean, the farms vary. I mean, our farm, you know, very complex topography and soils and so on, but it varies every 10 meters across the field. And where I farm now, it's only 2 miles from where I was born. And the soils behave very, very differently. And what's appropriate in terms of management, you know, it varies with the farm, and it also varies with the skills and interests of the farmer. So any policy that assumes uniformity it may work slightly better in the east of England, but it's really not going to work in the west of England. I don't think it will work in the east, actually. So that requires quite a sort of nuanced and localized approach to any sort of green transition, which again is going to be extremely difficult to implement.
So, Marijn, do you want to ask your question, which was about food security?
Yeah, I'll combine mine with another question as well. So my question was, you know, if all the food producing countries that we're currently importing from, if their food production is going to collapse because of climate change, but would we in the UK be able to produce enough food to sustain the people in the UK? And then at the same time, Kathy asked, a few years ago, actually, Michael Gove said that if we continued intensive farming as it is, the soil would be sterile in 30 years. So that sort of goes with that, you know, will we actually be able to produce the food we need for the people on these British Isles?
In an emergency,
In an emergency, can we feed ourselves?
No, you know, I mean, we've just been through, I mean, on this farm, we have been underwater for 6 months. We didn't manage to bring in all of our maize last autumn. We've only just combine harvested much of it now because the land is only just dry enough. And before that, we had a drought. And before that, we had, you know, flooding again. So we've had all of that, as well as we've not drilled whatever we did drill in the autumn has rotted, and we haven't managed to get any spring crops in, apart from we've managed to get some maize in now, and we're still drilling at the moment, which is late. So you put all together the current weather problems, then the Brexit collapse as well, and then you put together that with the lack of investment, really, largely, or the lack of imagination in successive British governments in supporting farming and food production, because they've always assumed that we'll be able to import it. And there's that famous headline from the Daily Mail, you know, we don't need farmers anymore. And that's really largely where we are. And it is the one thing that I think is the most frightening, because we are an island and we rely on the EU to feed us. They've now put in the extra trade barriers, which makes it more expensive and harder to bring food in here from the continent. And where is the food going to come from? So there should have been, with a decision to do Brexit, in my view, there should have been a decision to invest in food production, in sustainable, I know the buzzword's the same, but in good food production, not factories, to up food production, which is kind of what we did after the war with a grant system potentially, or something like that. But we don't even have a food plan. You know, Henry Dimbleby was drafted in to do a supposed food plan, and it was really useless, and it was basically a diet plan. So we are without a food plan. And we don't really know if, in an emergency, if there is going to be enough food, as we saw with the tomato and salad crisis last year. I'm pretty sure that going forward, there's going to be other issues. So.
Wow, that's very sobering, Liz. Thank you very much. Guy,
I don't really agree with that. I can't say categorically that we could feed ourselves. But I mean, we couldn't feed ourselves for sure without drastically changing our diet and eating significantly less animal protein, probably about a third of what we do today, which might be beneficial to our health in some instances, without without a lot less waste, and crucially, without paying quite a lot more for our food. I mean, there's land around me that was used for intensive horticulture 100 years ago, which is now not positively rewilded. It's just rewilded because it's not economic to farm it in any sense whatsoever. So, I mean, were we paying more for our food? I mean, I do think we could be massively more productive, and not necessarily at the cost at a cost to the environment. But instead of paying,
but if there's shortages overnight, then I mean that's what I'm answering, Guy. If there's shortages overnight, as we had of the tomatoes, because of the way the supply chains work, well, you can't just switch it on.
That's
it needs a long time to ramp up production. I mean, in the Netherlands, they show that we could be self-sufficient. They've proved that, but we have not had the years of investment that they've had in the Netherlands on food production.
Yeah, the Netherlands would be quite a good contrast of just how unbelievably productive a small country can be with that level of investment, capital investment in training and knowledge and so on. But yeah, Liz is right. It would take, at least 10 years and probably 20, and it would take a plan. And I'm going to stand here in defense of Henry Dimble, because I thought that was a really good report. And actually, he does reference a lot of the same things as you, Liz, the, repeal of the Corn Laws and so on. And I think I think it was 140 pages, and to get a grip of where we are now and what possibly some of the routes out of it, I do think it's a very good document. I think it's still obtainable online. And I would recommend it. We do desperately need a plan, as I've alluded to. I mean, to just leave this to Tesco's to determine our agricultural policy is going to be disastrous.
And may I jump in and ask, do you see any signs of Labour giving you such a plan, or do you think we're in a position of wait and see? I don't mind who goes first.
I think Liz might be better placed to answer that.
We've had meetings with Daniel. Sean, as I said, agricultural economist and agronomist now, has had 2 meetings with him, and we have given him a copy of a food plan that we think is viable. And so, you never know until the problem is that the supermarkets have got so much power, not only in terms of the public all go there to buy their food, but they give so much money to all of these political parties. They donate to them, which means that, they walk in the room and they get the attention. But having said that, we are forming a working group. We're going to be writing some policy to put to the shadow cabinet, which, gosh, I mean, here we are, we're how many weeks before election? 6, 7 weeks. So they could be, we need to sort of push. We were imagining this was going to happen in the autumn, the election, and now everything's been brought forward. So we will be working with them. We hope that they will act on it. If they don't, then we are determined to do more demonstrations. And what I think is that with the new MPs and a lot of these blue wall seats, which is inevitable, I'm sure that many of the Tories are going to go, that we will be holding the new MPs to account on this, because we can't carry on the way that we are, unless they decide to do the American trade deal and everything crashes. But that's that would just be cataclysmic if that happened.
Chris, you had a question about lost connectivity with the public around food and production. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation. That's brilliant. I was just thinking in terms of a plan that there seems to be a massive lost sort of connectivity with the public around food and how it's produced. And that we've got examples. I'm in property, so we've got a pannier market in the middle of Barnstable that isn't really used for food any longer. The supermarkets have put pay to that. We've got a regeneration project in Exeter where we've got opportunities to really drive forward connectivity between the public and food production, and for people to come in and pay a decent price for food, good, organic, locally produced food. Do the panelists think that's a way forward?
I think Liz, go on, you go.
I was just going to say, if we all went organic, well, you know, to go organic is a huge. It's not that straightforward, but also it means your yields will be lower. So it's about being organic. Isn't about. I mean, I think that a lot of farmers would always want to do the best that they can possibly do, but I think it's not necessarily about being organic, but I think it is about being viable. I think if somebody really wanted to change it, given what Guy is doing, that he's supplying food straight to the customers, and it is getting rid of the middleman. We're selling more of our maize to an AD plant down the road because it does just that, and you know, it gets you out of the loop. But there does need to be a better formulation, getting people to change their habits, to stop going to supermarkets and opening up our high streets as they used to be in the 70s would be marvellous, because that's what we used to have when I was growing up. But that probably is where the answer lies, that it's more locally produced and locally consumed. But how we unravel where we've, you know, the last 40 odd years of supermarket growth is another matter.
I think we desperately need some sort of alternative to the supermarket supply chains. I mean, the wholesale market, you know, my sector, vegetables, I agree with Liz. It's not all about being organic. Obviously, I wish that everyone could be, but I actually don't think it's the most important issue. We need an alternative for a smaller sort of family, a more human scale enterprise, you know, that's not so dependent on, you know, foreign, often to some extent abused labor. I think, but it's becoming a sort of self-fulfilling thing. And the bigger all this production gets, the harder. There is no infrastructure left to support anyone on a smaller scale. So I already mentioned the wholesale markets have largely gone. There's no independent retailers left to sell to on the whole. You know, it is, and all the machinery that you might use for an intermediate sized enterprise, that's becoming harder and harder, you know, to come by. There's some people producing stuff for the tiny, you know, a little bit more than a gardener scale production. And then there's the sort of vast machinery that I showed on some of our slides. So it becomes incredibly difficult for there to be any alternative. And I can look around us, you know, in Devon. I mean, along the south coast of Devon and Cornwall and around Land's End, you know, used to be a really vibrant horticultural sector, particularly winter brassicas, cauliflowers largely, and early potatoes. They've almost all gone. There's brassicas still in West Cornwall, but all the and this year our last potato producer gave up. We won't have any new potatoes until July. You know, we're getting Jersey Royals at the moment. Then we're going to go back onto old potatoes. We may even be importing them. I mean, you know, a time when Devon would have been at absolute sort of prime. All those small scale producers, well, they're not even small. You know, they might have been growing 100 acres of potatoes. But, you know, they're on relatively small scales. They've just been driven out of business. The supermarkets don't want to buy from them. You know, they have a short season. It's an unpredictable product. And so it's, you know, and to me, that is just a tragedy. You know, these are people that I went to school with. They're the farmers that I've known, and they're all, you know, they've become, you know, they might be running a holiday business, or maybe they're doing extensive sort of beef and sheep and whatever. And we're getting this dichotomy between that, and then we have the mega dairies, of which have just taken over our parish. There are two of them. And all the small dairies have gone. Whenever a farm is sold or land is rented, you know, a stockbroker will get the pheasant shooting, and these two families will take over anything that they can grow maize on. It's a social, environmental, and food quality disaster.
Just bringing it back, because you are here, you are a guest of MP Watch. So let's turn our gaze back to Westminster for a moment. There's kind of two questions here. What, if any, do farmers have a voice in decision making, in policy making at the moment? And if not, how do you envisage it? How could you influence decision making in Westminster? And Pat is asking, what can MP Watch do for farmers, and what can we do for both of you in your campaigns as well? I don't know who would like to go first. Liz, maybe?
Well, we have the NFU and we have the CLA as organisations, but the same thing applies in that whoever's the biggest and most wealthy gets the attention. And so the corporates have really largely taken over an awful lot of, or take up a lot of power from those organisations. I do work with an organisation called Northern Ireland Northern Ireland Farmers for Action, and they have got a piece of legislation that they're trying to get through Stormont, which is actually to encourage or to force local councils and so forth to ensure that all the local food is eaten and consumed before the imports come in. And I think, and to do with climate change and the carbon footprint and all of these sort of things. So I think that kind of legislation, if it goes through Stormont, could then go to Scotland, and it then might go through Wales, and then it might end up coming to England. And that may start to do something, but it's such a dramatic change that's needed that I just don't know where to begin, apart from really accepting that we were better off back within the CAP and the European Union. That's because I think things were not great then, but they're a hell of a lot worse now in Brexit land. And I think the only way that we're going to get any form of protection from WTO and these bad trade deals and everything else, which is like a tsunami coming, that we really need to get back within the shelter of the single market. Because the pushing of the modernization of Africa in particular and India is only, you know, in the medium term, I think we're going to see more imports coming in from there because they are ramping up production there like no tomorrow. Using slave labor and all of the rest of it, and pesticides and methods that are banned here.
Yeah, it's fairly hearing farmers, you know, as many of whom did vote for Brexit, you know, proclaiming that we'd be better off within Europe. I do find it's a bit bemusing. I think you may be right, but I mean, you know, the Common Agricultural Policy was an unmitigated disaster. I mean, environmentally, I don't think it served farmers particularly well. It's certainly better than what we got now, but I mean, the disruption of the last 8 years or something has been catastrophic. As I say, we did this survey that, you know, 49% of fruit and vegetable growers think they won't be in business next year. I mean, what? And it is happening very quickly. I mean, they are leaving the industry. And that I mean, I suppose, though, I would, you know, I was certainly a Remainer, and I certainly hope that we would not have the sort of hard Brexit that we've ended up with, which, I mean, you know, I suppose we do need to be reminded that it was, you know, get Brexit done. Let's not betray the deal, or whatever was the sort of mantra of a large part of the farming, you know, and anyway, sorry, it's all history. It's irrelevant, isn't it? It's happened. You know,
it's the reality of being outside of the single market, Guy, and the way that the WTO works, and also the thing that terrifies me is CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that deal means that corporations can sue national governments for legislating anything that harms corporations' profits. And that is, you know, that's just cataclysmic. As I said, they are ramping up production in Africa. Like, you know, the Chinese are going mad over there, and India the same under Modi. And, you know, it will end up, I think, with more and more ravaging of the world, really. That's what it is.
I mean, we left Europe. A lot of farmers wanted to be free of all that legislation. As it turned out, a lot of it wasn't European legislation anyway. But since, I have a farm in France, and I can tell you that since we left Europe, environmental legislation in Europe is getting tighter while it's getting laxer in the UK. And I think if farmers want us to rejoin in any way, whether it's just the single trade block or whatever, they better prepare themselves for some of that legislation. For instance, the plastic that's used on maize is banned in Europe because it is a gross contaminant of microplastics in the soil. It's been banned in Europe. It's legal in the UK. I think I'm right in saying neonicotinoids are pretty much banned in Europe. We continue to give ourselves derogations to use them in this country. Environmental legislation is going in one direction in Europe and the other direction in the UK. And if we rejoin, we better prepare ourselves for that. I did have a sort of hope that there might be a silver lining in the cloud with Brexit. And I do think we can do better than the Common Agricultural Policy. I think the Common Agricultural is bonkers.
So, Guy, do you think that would be, whether it's Dimblebiz or not, do you think that would be a kind of rethought food and farming policy that maybe brought farmers in? How would we set up a system that's better?
Well, I think the ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, is sort of pointing in the right direction. It's been painfully slow, and there have been some, an unnecessary amount of disruption and uncertainty along the road. But I think it's going in the right direction, and I would be very sad if we were to abandon it. We need to continue experimenting and fine-tuning it.
And
that's what I would argue for. And I think there's some great people in DEFRA trying to do that, but we desperately need a bit of stability, like we do in all sorts of things. We don't need Liz Truss coming in 60 days and saying she was going to throw it all out. And then, it has been, I think we've had 8 ministers of DEFRA in 14 years.
Yeah. Sorry,
stability.
to be fair, Liz, what would you advocate?
Well, I think the problem in just looking at it is if Britain can get what it wants is the thing that people don't understand. When you're in the single market, you are under an umbrella of safety from those world trade deal problems, and it's the imports that are the problem, and they're only going to increase. And it's like a tsunami. And so that is the main reason that we can only manage to shelter ourselves from that within the single market.
I completely agree with that, actually. Any idea that we can go out and cut a trade deal around the world on our own, I think has been shown to be just another one of Boris's lies.
Okay.
So I mean, that was the problem with farmers voting Brexit, was they thought we could go out and go back to 1950, but the world is in a different place to what it was in 1950. They've all moved into trading blocks, so you're there and then this little raft on your own, and you just get woof, blown out. So the only option that we see, and Sean Rickard and I are absolutely aligned on this, is to get back within. Really, we need to undo Brexit. That's what we need to do.
Okay, well, there was some really fascinating agreements and also differences of opinion there. Thank you so much for giving up your time on this evening, and thank you, Marine, for helping out and managing the questions and everything.
Can I say that I think, playing Mike Berners-Lee, a talk that he gave at a conference I went to, the only hope we have of solving our environmental policies is truth, honesty, and I think holding MPs to account is incredibly important. So I thank you all for what you're doing. I mean, without honesty, we have no hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I second that. Yes, we need to make sure that we get everyone politically activated and hold these MPs to account.
Yes. Thank you so much for that validation. We've got lots of work to do in the next 6 weeks, so it's good to have your blessings on that. Thank you all for your time. We'll be getting together an MP Watch Zoom soon to do some election planning, so please give us some time for that. But thank you for our wonderful guests giving us the benefit of your experience.